Today, we explore 10 myths about the Exodus on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. In this episode, we are going to explore 10 common myths associated with the Exodus. Some of these myths concern how the text is being read. Other myths deal with the baggage modern readers import into the interpretation of the Exodus. All of them are incongruent with what we know about the Exodus. The first myth we're going to start with is the ancient Israelites dressed like modern Bedouin. From church plays to Hollywood movies, ancient Israelites are often portrayed like modern Bedouin, wearing robes and headdresses. Ancient Israelites more typically dressed as other Semitic Asiatics. Those that entered Egypt wore varicolored tunics, like what we see in the Joseph story. And upon their entry into the Promised Land, they continued to wear tunics. The Bedouin did not wear the style of clothing they wear today until the 19th century. Until that time, their clothing was more in line with the fashions of the Ottoman Turks, through whose holdings they traveled. Myth number 2. The plagues of Egypt destroyed all the food, leaving Egypt vulnerable to its enemies. The idea is that the plagues of Egypt were so devastating to Egypt's food supply that it should have left the Egyptians with nothing to eat. And with starvation in the land, Egypt's enemies would have exploited the situation for easy conquest. The myth here concerns the magnitude of the 10 plagues, as well as the status of the Egyptian hegemony at the time of the Exodus. There are several aspects to this myth that need to be addressed. First, most of the plagues affected the agricultural season. Blights of this nature would have only affected the current agricultural cycle. Then, Egypt's agricultural cycle would have fully recovered the following year. Second, there is a tendency to overread the magnitude of the plagues. Most of the plagues would have been restricted to the Nile Delta, which was the regional focus of Egyptian power at the time of Ramses II. Furthermore, the book of Exodus does not state that all the food was destroyed. The text specifically mentions certain crops that were excluded from being damaged, that is, wheat and spelt, in Exodus 9:31. This is an important detail, because while the barley crop was destroyed, the Egyptians didn't typically eat barley. Instead, they used it for brewing beer as a form of water purification. The typical Egyptian ate emmer and wheat, so these plagues only destroyed a portion of the agriculture that the Egyptians did not use for food anyway. Finally, this myth misunderstands the diplomatic situation at the time of the Exodus. Egypt in the mid-13th century was at peace with all its neighbors. Nubia was completely subjugated by Egypt and was ruled by an Egyptian viceroy. The Mitanni Empire was on the verge of collapse, being on the cusp of annexation by the Assyrians. And the Hittites had just signed a peace treaty with the Egyptians. Anyone else was too weak to be a threat. Myth number 3. Moses was in line to become Pharaoh of Egypt. In Exodus 2:5-8, the text states that Pharaoh's daughter adopted Moses as a child. People reason that because Moses was the son of the daughter of a king, he must have been the grandson of the king, and therefore was in line to become king himself. This myth misunderstands how adoption works in Egypt and how royal succession functioned. Women in Egypt had an almost absolute right to adopt a child upon their own initiative. The only exceptions to this would be slave women and the women of the royal household that needed permission of the king to marry and adopt. This might seem like a problem for the biblical text. However, because the early life of Moses took place at Avaris, before the royal court had relocated to Goshen, this suggests that Moses was adopted by the daughter of Ramses I, the governor of Lower Egypt and future king of Egypt. As the daughter of Vizier Ramses, his daughter would have retained her right to adopt. And the text stating that Moses was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh is a retrojection, indicating her future elevated status. The other misunderstanding is how royal succession worked in Egypt. The eldest son of the great queen was first in line of succession, followed by the sons of minor queens. After that, it was a free-for-all between powerful courtiers. The adopted sons of daughters of the king were not sons of the king and had no position in the line of succession. Myth number 4. 2 million people were part of the Exodus. This is based upon a numerical reading of the census numbers of numbers 1, 2, and 25. The idea is that if there were 600,000 men who were of fighting age, then if you add the same number of women plus children and the elderly, you get a number of Israelites that was between 2 and 3 million people. Suffice it to say that this has interpretive, logistical, demographic, and historiographic problems. The logistical problem is coordinating an exodus of people in the millions. Organizing the movement of this many people would have presented a serious problem for the Israelites. The demographic problem is that the population of Avaris was probably no more than 50,000 people, perhaps as many as 100,000 persons. And if we include the surrounding areas of Semitic habitation, for example the Wadi Tumilat, a number in the low six figures is possible. But this is nowhere near the 2 to 3 million, which would have been a greater number than all the people who lived in Egypt at the time. The interpretive problem is the Hebrew word eleph, which can mean thousands, but it can also mean army, division, clan, or even heroes. Hebrew lexemes have a broad semantic range, which can make knowing exactly what is being said sometimes difficult. Recently, Bart Ehrman stated that he knew of no Hebrew scholar who would suggest any other meaning to eleph than thousand. Evidently, he had not read the entries for eleph in Halot. The historiographic problem is that documents that we rely upon for ancient history have a tendency to exaggerate population numbers for reasons that are still not clear to historians. We find this with the account of the Spartans at Thermopylae and the conquest of Alexander the Great, who, in both cases, are said to fight against millions of Persians. This exaggeration of numbers means we cannot take these figures at face value because we don't understand why such exaggeration was done. However, no historian would automatically dismiss everything else said in those records as myth or fiction. Myth number 5. The Sea of Reeds, also known as the Red Sea, was a deep body of water. This is another myth exaggerated by the movies. The movies want to create dramatic tension by showing the ominous division of the Sea of Reeds. And unfortunately, too many people, and even Bible scholars, have assimilated movie culture into their exegesis. But there's nothing in the biblical texts that suggests the water was deep. Egyptian records indicate that the Sea of Reeds was part of the Pelusiac estuary. The water in those lakes was only between 20 to 40 feet deep. This is more than deep enough to drown horse and driver alike. Moreover, the biblical text states that the Lord sent a strong wind from the east to divide the waters, Exodus 14:21. Wind set-downs, strong winds that can push water back, are known to occur in the eastern Nile Delta. For the wind to be strong enough to part the waters, but not so strong as to be a hindrance to Israelite movement, the water had to be less than 50 feet in depth. It is the perfect environmental conditions combined with water of the right depth at the right place and time. God working through nature, not against it. Myth number 6. Pharaoh sent his chariots to recapture the Israelites and bring them back to Egypt. This myth misunderstands the role of Egypt's military in how it captured and transported slaves. The text says in Exodus 14:5, quote, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" End quote. Many have interpreted this to mean that Pharaoh sent out the chariots to round up and bring back the Israelites. However, Pharaoh's intentions were much more sinister than they appear at first blush. Pharaoh sent out the chariots to chase down the Israelites without infantry support. It was the infantry who carried the slaver poles, special poles used to subdue and transport slaves. Chariots, on the other hand, were mobile archery platforms. The intention of Pharaoh was to massacre the Israelites with the chariots, and then, when the infantry finally arrived after the chariots, the foot soldiers would recapture the few surviving slaves. Myth number 7. All Pharaoh's army was destroyed. The myth here is that all of Pharaoh's army was destroyed at the Red Sea. Now, we've already covered this in another video, but it's still worth mentioning since it is a common myth. Some have suggested that, quote, all his army, end quote, was destroyed per Exodus 14:4. However, the text restricts this hyperbolic language in verse 17, quote, all his army through his chariots and his horses, end quote. It appears that only the chariots stationed in the eastern Nile Delta would have been destroyed. The chariot division stationed in the western Delta would have been too far away to get to the battle on time. Furthermore, most of the infantry escaped destruction in the Red Sea just because they hadn't had the time to catch up to the chariots. Myth number 8. Pharaoh died in the Sea of Reeds. There is no suggestion in the biblical text that Pharaoh drowned in the Sea of Reeds. At best, it is a misreading of Psalm 136:15, which mistakes the traditional reading of Na'ar for its actual meaning to, quote, shake off. The sources for this myth come out of rabbinic Jewish and Islamic traditions. However, none of the mummified remains of the kings of Egypt show signs of having experienced sudden drowning, for example, sand in the nose and throat. But more importantly, the Bible doesn't support the idea that Pharaoh died in the Red Sea. Myth number 9. If there was a historical exodus, the Egyptians would have made records of it happening. This is a very popular myth among skeptics of a historical exodus. I've even heard it repeated by the likes of Michael Shermer, and I've even heard Bart Ehrman use a version of this myth. It's the idea that the Egyptians were fastidious record keepers, that if the Exodus had occurred, that the Egyptians would have made a record of the event, and that we would have that record today. Unfortunately, what makes this myth is the snug premise that we have a completely preserved record of Egyptian history. This reveals a complete ignorance of the state of Egyptian archaeology. Most of the writings we have from Egypt are religious or funerary texts. These are texts where one would never record disasters or bad news, since they are offerings to the gods. The day-to-day goings-on of the royal court were recorded in papyrus day rolls, and sadly, few day rolls have actually survived. Even from periods for which we have a lot of textual evidence, for example, the Amarna period, the day rolls have not survived. Thus, we are in complete darkness about the circumstances surrounding the death of Akhenaten and the early days of his successor. Admittedly, we also do not have the day rolls or court records from the reign of Ramses II. All we have is his monumental inscriptions. But then again, this is not to be unexpected either. The scriptorium at Avaris held over 300 documents according to the clay seals that have been recovered. However, none of these documents have survived, except the fragments of 2 clay tablets. Nothing has been found at Ramses II's capital at Paramses. So even if the Egyptians had written something about the Exodus down, it is unlikely to have survived in the archaeological record. And finally, myth number 10. There's no evidence for an Exodus. Okay, this is perhaps the most common myth I encounter. I've heard skeptics like Bart Ehrman use this myth. I've also heard historical revisionists and early Exodus date supporters use this myth to say that one should look in other places in history for evidence of the Exodus. At one level, this is an absence of evidence argument. Bart Ehrman said, quote, "This is an absence of evidence, but is a big absence," end quote. The fallaciousness of this thinking boggles the mind. David Hackett Fisher said it best, quote, "Evidence must always be affirmative. Negative evidence is a contradiction in terms. It is no evidence at all," end quote, page 62. A big absence is a big nothing. And such statements are turned into a joke with the merest turn of the shovel. At another level, this is a myth of definition. I have heard Maggie Bryson once say that, quote, "There is no evidence of Israelites worshiping Yahweh in Egypt," end quote. This is completely true, but it is also moving the goalpost through redefinition. We should not expect to find Israelites so named in Egypt. The sons of Jacob are Amoritic Semites called Amu by the Egyptians. They leave Egypt as a mixed multitude of many ethnicities. They don't become Israelites proper until they are galvanized as a single nation in Sinai. They also did not worship Yahweh in Egypt, Joshua 24:14. We know that they served Canaanite gods in Egypt, Baal, Resheph, and Astarte. Moses brought Yahweh to the Israelites from his time in Midian. At another level still, it raises the bar of evidence to a point of incredulity. Josh Bowen once commented on the Merneptah victory stela, quote, "Yes, it mentions Israelites, but those aren't the same Israelites," end quote. Huh? What? When one raises the standard of evidence to a level nothing can qualify as evidence, one is now engaging in question begging. That is, one cannot prove a one-to-one equivalence between the Israelites and any other group, such as the Israelites in the Merneptah stela. Without necessary equivalence, such historical records cannot be used as evidence. Therefore, there is no evidence for the Exodus. I'm sure you can see the problem with that. The other problem is that such approaches limit the kind of evidence one can consider, and thus weeds out evidence that would be considered appropriate in any other historical analysis. In normal historical method, one can consider both direct and indirect evidences as well as internal and external evidences. The book of Exodus has internal evidence that strongly suggests that the sons of Jacob were physically present in Egypt. Examples of this are the Egyptian birth customs, culinary methods, funerary customs, propinquity of the actors, loanwords, and local Egyptian geography. That is evidence, even if one does not like where that evidence leads. But to say that there is no evidence does a complete disservice to the truth. So, anyway, that covers our 10 common myths concerning the Exodus. We hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something today. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.